us. We have to behave our way into some new thinking, and that's going to be uncomfortable for us, but God is already blessing those efforts, right? And so I'm going to tell you some stories about some new things that you're trying and other people are trying, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you do this together. And then this afternoon, we're going to give you some options for things you can try as a team and that you can invite your congregation into doing. Okay, so first let's start with a story that some of you are familiar with, and I'll tell you the short version, okay? For those of you, so I don't bore the ones who've heard it before. So this is a house that I own in the great state of Minnesota, in the city of Minneapolis. Thank you very much. You know, Minnesota is really like central New York. Like when we're driving around, it's very similar. And these two chairs represent an action learning experiment that I did, where I was trying to learn, how do I connect with these neighbors who just go into their homes and don't talk to each other? How do we build relationship with them? And so because I was interested in learning about that, I decided to sit in really crummy plastic chairs out in front of my house for a summer and do some reading that I needed to do for some coursework I was engaged in the morning, and then in the afternoon, in the evening after dinner, to just sit in these two chairs pretty much every day for most of the summer. And my hope was just to signal to the neighbors, I'm available, I want to know you, I'm out here, right? I'm not sitting in my backyard where there's a fence and there's a barrier, I'm sitting in the front yard. I know many of you have done some of this experimenting yourself. So my experience with this was that in one summer, I met 90% of my neighbors on my block, when I had lived there for 2 or 3 years and met only a handful before that. There was something about being present in my front yard consistently that signaled to people, I would like to know who you are. Including one woman who walked out of her house 3/4 of the block down and came all the way down one afternoon and introduced herself and said, I've seen you sitting out here consistently. I wonder if there's something wrong with you, but I came over. I came to introduce myself and say, I live down here and I've been here 5 years, and here's who I am. So there's an example of doing something differently, acting differently, helps you think differently, and also signals to other people something that they may not have heard from you or sensed from you before. Now here's one you've never heard of before, an action learning experiment. It's a new innovation, okay? Some people in the great state of New York decided that they would try to learn how they could engage in offering prayer to neighbors who maybe weren't part of their local parish communities. And one of the ways that they decided to do that was to go to all sorts of places, farmers markets, fairs, summer fairs, other community gatherings, and set up tables and simply put out these strips of cloth and say, if you have a prayer request and you'd like to write it down on this strip of cloth, we're going to collect them, you can tie them right here, and then we will pray for them as a group. Anybody heard of this experiment before? Some of you have? Okay. A lot of folks in the diocese have been engaged in this one. And I know that for some of you who were thinking about doing this last summer, this was kind of terrifying, right? Like, wait, so we're going to go out in public and ask people if they want us to pray for them? That's what you want? That's what you're suggesting we do? But many of you discovered that people were very willing to share some of their prayer requests. And on top of that, some of you started to reflect on this and say, we're amazed at the insight that we're getting from reading the prayer requests that people have given to us. We have an insight into some of the pain and concern and worry and anxiety in some of our communities through these prayer requests that we probably wouldn't have been aware of in the same way had we not done that. Now, for some of us, our instincts are, wow, we went to this fair and we set up this prayer flag table and 20 people decided to give us prayer requests, or 50 people decided to give us prayer requests. What we now need is for the bishop to institutionalize this and programatize it. We need prayer flags at every fair and farmer's market across central New York. We want to be known as the prayer flag diocese, and we want to build quilt upon quilt of prayer flag requests all over central New York, and we're probably going to need a cannon for prayer flags, which I'm going to apply for that job. I'm going to try to get that job. There's a sense when we start to see the Holy Spirit working and we start to sense that people are responding, sometimes we want to institutionalize it right away, right? And programatize it. Where one of my reflections and some of the coordinating team's reflections on this particular effort has been, what if what God is saying to you is that we all are trying to learn how to become a healing presence in the midst of communities who really are desperate for healing. And that started to connect with other things that were happening in the diocese with the new visioning process and some other conversations that are happening among clergy and lay leaders and other folks to say, yeah, that really might be something that God is saying to us collectively as a diocese. How do we become a healing presence in the various communities that we're a part of? That doesn't mean we got to have prayer flags at every farmer's market across the state. It does mean we may need to take some more risks to learn more about what that means for us to become a healing presence in some of the communities. And we're going to talk more about that this afternoon. Okay, here's one more story about an experiment. So the church that I'm a part of in Minneapolis, once upon a time, we were trying to learn what would it be like to have worship in a space that wasn't a church space that people felt intimidated to come into. And so we wondered together, is there any way that we could learn to worship in a public space? All right? And so this picture of this lady, which you can't see super well on the left there, her name is Mary. And I got to know her because she owns a coffee shop in our neighborhood, and we spend a lot of time in coffee shops. And so I've known Mary for 10 years now. So we went to Mary and we said, she owns a coffee shop named Maeve's, and Mary's not a Christian person, but she knows we're church people and she tolerates us anyway. And we said to Mary, would you ever allow us to have a worship service in your coffee shop? Which was kind of a bold thing to ask her. But we had a good enough relationship, we knew she'd say no if she didn't like the idea. And she said, yeah, fine, that'd be great. Will people buy coffee? I said, yeah, they will, I'm sure they will, they love coffee. And she said, so what if we do it on a weeknight when I normally close at 8 or something? Can we just do it from like 8 to 9 and I'll just stay open an extra hour and the church people can buy coffee? Yeah, fine, that's awesome. Do you mind if we put a sign out front that just says people can come in and pray with us or worship with us if they want to? Yeah, fine, that sounds great. So we have this worship service and the coffee shop is full. It's like pop-up worship, right? Like we just pick this coffee shop, we have relational trust with this woman from being present in her life and in the neighborhood and in her business. She trusts us. We have this worship service in her coffee shop, and there's 30-some people at this little goofy worship. It's like as many as you could get in this little coffee shop. And there's just one person with a guitar, and we're doing our, we had to figure out a liturgy for how do you do this in a coffee shop, but we did it. And it was amazing. And so, what we learned was, hey, there's hospitality in the neighborhood, even for worship. Even for distinctly Christian worship, there are businesses who are open to us hosting a Christian activity, distinctly Christian activity, in their space. And that invites a whole different group of people to engage than we might otherwise engage with. So those are 3 examples. Sit in some chairs, offer prayer opportunities at farmers markets and fairs, or learn to host a worship service in another space. All of these are examples of experiments, action learning experiments. This is not scientific technical language, so if you're a scientist and I've already offended you by the way that I'm using the word experiment, I apologize. We're talking about just trying to use action learning to try things that might fail, that might succeed, but the goal is for us to try some new things and learn from them. So experiments in this process is a planned action learning experience that's designed to help us behave our way into new thinking. Does that make sense to you? What's the point of experiments? So this is really key. Experiments are the best way to learn when we are faced with challenges that require us to adapt and do something differently than we've done it before. They create space for us to discover new ways to be the church in our context. So it's really hard to adapt or innovate without behaving in some new ways. It's hard to think your way or talk your way into new behaviors and actions and new ways of being church. You really need to act in some fresh ways in order to learn those kinds of things. This is maybe the most important part of this training, the content of this training day. What makes an experiment, an action learning experiment, successful? How do we decide if it's successful? The success of an experiment is determined by how much we learn and how much we are transformed, rather than by how much impact our actions have on other people. Okay, so let's just sit with that for a second, because I really want to make sure this sinks in. We are used to taking actions as church folks that we intend to have significant impact on other people. For example, we host a food shelf where once a month, twice a month, once a week, we offer food to people who might be having a hard time getting enough food in their house. Our intention for our actions is to provide food to people who don't have enough food, right? Do we get blessed by that? Yes, we do. Of course we do. But really, the main focus is getting food to people who don't have enough food. So a lot of the time when we're thinking about a church thing we're doing, we're focused on, well, what's the outcome? What is going to be the impact of it? And it's very hard for many of us to say we're doing something because we need to learn something or we need to change, rather than we hope to accomplish this thing with this action right now. Is that making sense to you? So these are designed to help us grow and help us change, so we have a better sense of what God is doing, what God is inviting us into, so that we can shape our future actions in ways that are in line with God's leadership to us. So the prayer flags are a great example of this, right? We tried something. We blessed other people for sure, but we learned a ton. Those of you who did that and heard the stories of it, we learned that, one, we were surprised that people trusted us as much as they did with their prayer requests. And we learned how much healing is needed in our own hearts and our own lives and in our communities. And now we're challenged to learn again, what does it really look like for us to be people who, by the power of God's Spirit, can help foster healing in these communities? And we don't know the answer to that, and so we're going to have to try some more new things in order to get to that point. Is that making sense to you? Okay, so if you were going to design an experiment, if you're going to shape one yourself and decide something you want to do, there's three kind of major steps. And in your packet, these are written down for you. I can't remember what page. 8. You all remember what page. It's 8. There are 3 major steps to designing an experiment. First one, just name what you want to learn. Okay? What is it you're trying to learn? If you don't name what you want to learn, you'll end up doing a bunch of interesting things, but you can't remember exactly what you were doing them for, or what you were hoping would come out of it. So we're trying to learn, we're trying to grow. What do you want to learn? And then what are the steps that you're going to take? Specifically, like we're meeting here, we're going here, we're talking to these folks, we'll be done by this time, and then we're going to eat together or something. It always ends with we're going to eat together, doesn't it? And then finally, create a feedback loop. A feedback loop is just where do we get to discuss what we did so that we can reflect on it and harvest some of the learning. So we're not just doing things without a chance to talk about them and reflect on them. Let me give you a couple of more quick examples of other things that people have done in other places. So here's an experiment where the goal was, we want to learn what God is doing in our changing neighborhood. Lots of congregations tell me the neighborhood that we're in is really different than it was 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 20 years ago. The demographics are different, the socioeconomics are different, the jobs are different, a lot of things have changed. So how do we learn about what God is doing in the midst of that change? So this group decided one way they could do that was to invite people in the congregation to shop at a different grocery store. So I don't know, maybe not everybody has 2 grocery stores in their town, but the idea here is to start to change your normal habit for whom you engage with and go to a different place. So this was a church outside of Spokane, Washington. And most of their people drove into this church. The neighborhood had changed. And so there was a much larger Hispanic population right around the geographic place where the church was located, but people weren't engaged with that community. So they all were challenged to go do their grocery shopping at a grocery store that was way more Hispanic to a Hispanic consumer than to a white consumer, and that was very challenging for them. Just trying to go to a new grocery store and say, well, what does this say about who comes here and what God's up to here? And but it was a very good learning experience for them to become more aware of who their neighbors were in their local context to where their church was. Here's another example. A group of people out in California who wanted to learn, how can we practice Jesus' teaching on giving to the poor? And I know engaging in issues of poverty is a priority in this diocese as well. So these guys were reading the Sermon on the Mount together, and they got to the part where Jesus was saying, sell your stuff and give to the poor. And they thought, well, that seems really challenging. Can we dial it back a little bit from what Jesus said and just try to do some experimenting here? And so they came up with this experiment that they called Have Two, Give One. Okay? And I like to say it's a little bit of Marie Kondo. Do you guys know who Marie Kondo is out here?
Yeah.
Netflix sensation where you're blessing your shirts or something? Exactly? You can tell me later. So Marie Kondo meets Jesus' teaching somehow, where they were saying, week one, everybody get out all their shoes. Go home, get out all your shoes. See if you can give some pairs of shoes away, right? Maybe you have 10 pairs of shoes and you only need 5. Okay, bring your 5 pair of shoes to our next meeting, and we're going to collect all our shoes, decide which ones really just need to be thrown away, and then keep the ones that maybe would be useful to somebody else. Okay, next week we're going to work on shirts. Following week we're going to work on dinnerware. The week after that, so they spent 6 or 8 weeks going through different categories of goods and saying, maybe you have 2 and you only need 1. And then their neighbors started to get wind of the fact that they were doing this. And the plan was to just have a major yard sale at the end and sell their stuff and choose a charity to give the money to. So the neighbors that weren't Christians got wind of this and said, we have too much stuff. Can we get in on the decluttering process that you guys are all in? They end up with this massive sale, garage sale, yard sale, where people had not only been blessed by having less junk in their house, but also the quality goods that were left that they could sell, they ended up giving this money away. And all of that was just to say, we want to learn about taking Jesus' teaching seriously about sell some of your stuff and give it to the poor. Here's a 21st century way to do that actually could really help the people who were invested in doing it themselves. So there's another example. Last example, and then we need to move on to some other pieces, but some of you have heard this story. Raise your hand if you know about a purple bus. Okay, there's purple buses. I wasn't going to tell this story, but Canon John insisted that I tell it. So I'm going to tell you the 2-minute version. This is a bus that in my neighborhood, Northeast Minneapolis, runs from our neighborhood to the Southern Casino about 45 minutes away. And we've learned that there is such a bus here in New York, somewhere, in Syracuse maybe, or somewhere around there, but we don't know what color it is yet, right? Bambi's working on figuring out what color it is. So the bus is intended to pick people up. It's a free ride. You go from our neighborhood, 45 minutes to the casino, you can gamble, you can get on the bus, you can come home. It runs twice a day. Our learning objective was, what is God doing in the lives of the people who ride the casino bus? That's what we want to learn. We're interested because they're our neighbors, and we want to know what makes them go to the casino. So we got 8 people together, put them in pairs, because there's some text that talks about traveling in pairs, and we got on at 4 different bus stops in our neighborhood, because there are that many bus stops, and we thought it would be extremely creepy if 8 Christians all got on the casino bus at the same time. We're like, hey, we're here to meet you. That wasn't going to go well. So we got on at different times to be less creepy, and then the goal was to just sit next to people we didn't know and strike up conversations. When I got on the bus with my friend Aaron, who's also tall like me, a little taller, I thought, this is one of the worst ideas I've ever come up with as a pastor. Seriously. Terrible idea. I don't like striking up conversations with strangers. I don't know exactly how this is going to go. It just seemed like a bad idea. But we had gotten really specific about the steps, like, here's what you do. Sit near somebody, but not on top of somebody. Here's what you say to them. We're from the neighborhood, and we're interested in why people ride the bus to the casino. Be honest about the fact that you're from a church. Don't try to tell people that they have to be a Christian. Like, we went through all these different steps so that the anxiety could go down some. And then we got on the bus, and we rode 45 minutes to the casino. We got off the bus, and then we were eating at the buffet, because why not, right? You're at the casino buffet. And that was our feedback loop to say, how did it go? And for some people, it went terribly. Like, they tried to start a conversation, person didn't want to talk. That's it. They sat there for 45 minutes in silence. For some of us, we got a pretty good conversation going, and there was a lot of relational connection that happened. The guy that I talked to was a 20-year-old college student from Nigeria who was trying to gamble his way through his education at the University of Minnesota. Told me that he was $3,000 down for the spring, but that he really felt like he was coming around. Like, he's getting the hang of it. It's like, okay. And then one woman, one of the women on our team connected with the woman on the bus who had just gone through a divorce, who was super depressed, who was going to the casino just as an escape, and ended up in this beautiful conversation where she could listen to her and pray for her and just kind of create some relational space for her. So we got done with the meal there, and then the worst part of the experiment was that I didn't realize that the bus only goes back every 6 hours. Oh my God. Because they want you to stay at the casino, right? And I had no other plan for getting back. So then the team was all looking at me like, this is so well planned. So now we're stuck at the casino. Do we gamble? Like, what do you want us to do now, Pastor? This is the weirdest church activity I've ever been invited into. So we had to call friends in Minneapolis and say, could you drive down here 45 minutes to pick us up? And it wasn't the greatest. It had some failures in it. But man, we were so transformed by the experience. We learned a lot about the people on the bus. We didn't start a program for outreach to people on purple buses. Instead, we said, now we have a better understanding of why some of our neighbors might be traveling to the casino and back, and it helps us in our overall mission of our church, which is to love our community in the name of Jesus. And we've repeated this several times with other folks to try to indoctrinate them into what this crazy church is that they're part of now. So all these examples are meant to help you see, here's how you state a learning objective, here's how you act in a new way in order to learn something, and then reflect on that action in order to see what it is that God might be teaching you. And it's not something you do once, as was mentioned this morning during the dwelling. It's a habit, it's a lifestyle, it's a way of doing ministry consistently to say, is there something we need to learn? Could we act to learn it? Or should we talk about it some more? And then can we reflect on those actions? So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna look at a case study of a pretend Episcopal church, which is in your packet if you want to find pretend Episcopal church.
On page
And
11.
some folks are going to lead us through talking about how could we coach pretend Episcopal church. And I think there's a few folks who have to leave, so we just want to say, hey, thank you for being here this morning, and God bless you. Have fun at the wedding. I know there's a big wedding today. And Pat and Bambi are going to lead us through pretend Episcopal church.